Turkish Airlines is finally flying to Australia, 10 years after their first announcement back in 2013. The chairman of Turkish Airlines, Ahmet Balat, mentioned that Turkish Airlines will finally begin flying to Melbourne, Australia on December of this year, with a technical stop at Singapore. While it wasn't an official announcement and no dates were announced, it's finally coming, and I want to talk about it. I'll be analyzing a bunch of articles dating back to around 2013, talking about how Turkish Airlines wants to operate non-stop flights to Australia and talking about the possible future of Turkish Airlines in Australia. Turkish already flies to 129 countries in the entire world, more than any airline in 5 continents: Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America. But Australia is the last inhabited continent Turkish doesn't already fly to. A non-stop flight from Istanbul to Sydney would be the third longest flight in the world as of 2023, behind Singapore Airlines, Singapore to New York, and Singapore to New York JFK. It would be 14,976 kilometers or 9,300 miles long, and it would very likely take over 17 hours to fly the route. A flight to Melbourne would be a bit shorter, but not by much, at 9,093 miles long with a similar flight time. This makes it a very complicated route to fly non-stop. Right now, Turkish doesn't have any aircraft that can operate the flights with a full payload. Sure, the Boeing 787-9 and A350-900 could operate the route, but with a reduced payload that would very likely mean fewer seats or a more premium configuration that Turkish Airlines doesn't want. Turkish Airlines has wanted to operate these flights for just over a decade now. You can find articles dating back to around 2013 showing their intentions to fly to Australia non-stop. Turkish was initially planning to operate the flight with a stop in Southeast Asia at either Jakarta or Bangkok, starting in 2014 using the Boeing 777-300ER, because they didn't have an aircraft that was able to operate the flight non-stop. However, Turkish was planning to operate non-stop flights from Atatürk International Airport within 3 years using either the Boeing 777-200LR or the Airbus A340-500, the only aircraft capable of operating the flight non-stop at the time, and were being used in the flights from Singapore to New York and Doha to Auckland, the latter of which started in 2016. Although nowadays Singapore to New York is now flown on a more efficient Airbus A350-900 ULR with a more premium configuration similar to the A340-500, except it does have premium economy, while Doha to Auckland is set to resume the Airbus A350-1000 after being suspended for 3 years. However, none of these plans actually came to fruition. While it was possible to fly to Sydney non-stop, it would have very likely been at a massive loss, especially because the 777-200LR and the A340-500 are very inefficient aircraft and consume a heck of a lot of fuel. So the flights were delayed, multiple times actually. Turkish Airlines mentioned the flights once again in 2016, except this time Turkish was planning to fly to both Sydney and Melbourne with a stop at Denpasar in Indonesia, although they also considered stopping in Jakarta or Singapore as well. No aircraft was specified, but it would have most likely been the 777-300ER. Unfortunately, the flights to Australia were never mentioned once again until 2022, most likely because of the pandemic and the lack of aircraft. Turkish Airlines instead decided to strengthen their hub and spoke network. Turkish added loads of short-haul destinations in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia that are within reach of narrow-body aircraft like the Boeing 737 and Airbus A321neo, as well as long-haul destinations that are within the range of the existing aircraft like the 777-300ER and the Airbus A330, as well as the Boeing 787-9 and the Airbus A350-900 that enabled Turkish Airlines to expand to new destinations that are either too small for the 777 or too far for the A330, including a massive expansion towards North America. However, there were talks in 2019 about Turkish Airlines investing in buying a stake on Virgin Australia, and even though flights to Australia were not mentioned, such a stake would very likely mean that Turkish would plan to fly to Australia in order to connect with Virgin at any Australian airport such as Melbourne or Sydney. However, Turkish never bought a stake on Virgin Australia. And then the pandemic happened, and Turkish didn't mention any plans to fly to Australia, probably due to the fact that Australia was under some of the strictest lockdown in 2020 and 2021. Instead, they kept expanding towards North America, Europe, and other markets. And then in 2022, Turkish once again teased the possibility to begin flights to Australia, except this time, they actually seemed serious about it. They mentioned they could begin flights to both Sydney and Melbourne by 2023 with a stop in Southeast Asia and non-stop at a later date. The CEO of Turkish Airlines even mentioned the possibility of ordering the Boeing 777X or the Airbus A350-1000 to operate these flights. Whenever we make a decision on one of these planes, it will be the right time. Let's see how both types develop. We don't need to be a launch customer. We will have to see proof of the maturity of the Boeing 777X or the Airbus A350-1000. That's what Ahmed Bolat, the chairman of Turkish Airlines, said. He also mentioned that it is possible to fly using the Airbus A340-500 and the Boeing 777-200LR, but the airline found that such operation would not be profitable under current circumstances. And finally, we're in the year 2023. Turkish Airlines has outlined that they want to double in size by 2033, and this includes not only doubling the airline's fleet, but also massively increase the airline's revenue and finances, as well as the route network. And this will definitely include flights to Australia. And this time they're actually serious about it. And the CEO of Turkish said back in April, if the delivery of new generation wide-body aircraft is done as promised by the manufacturers, we aim to start with 3 flights per week from Istanbul to Sydney or Melbourne before the end of 2023. At first, it's going to be a 3 weekly flight with a stopover in Southeast Asia, but the goal is to have a non-stop daily flights to both cities and possibly to other cities as well in the future, as flights to Australia are apparently a high priority for Istanbul Airport. And then, on June 14, 2023, finally, Turkish Airlines announced that they want to begin flights to Australia by December 2023. That is less than 6 months from now, before the end of the year. The plan is to begin flights to Melbourne 3 times a week with a technical stop at Singapore. There will be no fifth freedom rides or anything like that. Bolad said that's not really needed, as there are plenty of flights between Singapore and Australia. The flight will rely solely on Melbourne to Istanbul traffic, as well as connections to Istanbul. Turkish chose Melbourne because it has a larger Turkish population and fewer flight options than Sydney, despite having almost similar metropolitan populations, as well as a big catchment area that can bring a lot of tourists to Turkey, and connecting passengers that may want to use Istanbul as a gateway into Europe, especially because Turkish flies to over 100 cities in Europe, more than any other airline that flies to Australia. The CEO did mention that it is possible to fly to Perth at the moment with a full payload, but because of the winds at certain times of the year, they may need a stopover during such times, and Turkish doesn't want to operate these flights with a stop because that would reduce the competitiveness of the flights to Perth. However, as of now, Turkish is only allowed to fly 4 times a week between Turkey and Australia, but they plan to eventually offer daily flights to both Sydney and Melbourne once they get the approval for it, and they plan to make these flights non-stop within the next 5 years, for which Turkish is going to need a longer range aircraft that is capable of profitably operating the route non-stop. Turkish has mentioned they want to use either Boeing 777X or the Airbus A350-1000 on the routes, since they may not require the payload restrictions that may be required if the airline were to operate a Boeing 787-9 or an A350-900. These aircraft would be larger, so they would have more flexibility when it comes to reducing capacity or payload on the aircraft while still carrying a massive amount of passengers on the route. For now, these flights are going to be operating with the Boeing 787-9, but may eventually be upgraded to the Airbus A350-900 as demand begins to increase on the route. And as I mentioned before, this would also include a stop in Singapore. I would also expect Turkish to also begin non-stop flights to other cities like Brisbane or Perth, using the same aircraft type as a flight to Sydney and Melbourne. I would actually love for Turkish to also begin flights to Auckland, New Zealand at some point in the future. However, these flights will have to have a stop in Southeast Asia in order for this flight to work out because of the longer distance between Istanbul and Auckland. But that would still be a great addition because Turkish already co-shares with Air New Zealand, and it could help Turkish access multiple cities in Oceania from there. But either way, Turkish can still access New Zealand from Sydney and Melbourne because Air New Zealand offers flights to multiple cities from there. I would also expect Turkish to launch some sort of codeshare agreement with some airline in Australia, such as Virgin Australia or Qantas, to access more of the Australian market. I'd probably go with Virgin. But anyway, I'm really excited for Turkish to finally begin flights to Australia. I've been waiting for over a decade now for this flight to finally happen, and I'm really happy to see it coming. We don't know the exact dates or anything, but at the very least, we can finally see it coming very soon. I can't wait for the final announcement. For the exact dates, Turkish will finally begin flights between Istanbul and Melbourne with a stop at Singapore, 3 times per week at first, followed by daily flights eventually, followed by flights to Sydney, and in about 5 years' time, non-stop flights with the Boeing 777X or the Airbus A350-1000, and then flights to Perth, and then to Brisbane. And who knows, maybe they'll be so popular that maybe one day we'll see double daily flights to both Melbourne and Sydney, and maybe even Auckland with a stop in Southeast Asia. Sounds great. I seriously hope it happens, and I seriously wish Turkish Airlines the best in the future as they enter the last continent they are yet to reach. Thank y'all for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If y'all got any comments, questions, or any feedback, y'all can leave a comment. I also got an Instagram that y'all can follow. I post some pretty cool stories and pictures over there, so go ahead and check it out. I also got a Twitter. I'm not really active on there, but y'all can check it out if y'all want. That's all I got to say, and I'll see y'all later.